So Sam, I rewatched your movie for the second and a half time this morning, and I again am filled with so many questions and responses because you're really doing a lot here to just make me even ask questions about the photographic archive in relation to the FBI surveillance, the ways that we see a public figure like MLK. But I want to start by asking you a question that you asked toward the end of your film of the historians who've been narrating so much of this story, which is, what was your sense of your responsibility to the material? Something you ask of the historians. Just now they have this, and you open the movie with this as well. That now we have this trove of perhaps insightful material about MLK, but the source of it, the motivations of it, the things that it may or may not reveal, and the ways that it was used against him are troubling for anyone trying to find ways to integrate this into how we understand this man. So for you as a filmmaker wrestling with this, what was your sense of responsibility and your position relative to these materials?
Well, that's a really good question, Cameron. When I first started out making films as a young man, I used to think that when I created a film, things were pretty black and white. You would create the good guys and the bad guys, growing up in that sort of American culture where you watched all these movies, they were the good guys and the bad guys, the white hats and the black hats. So some of my early films was sort of basically, that was the concept and that was the structure. But as I've evolved as a human being and understand the complexity of the world, the complexity of human beings, you realize that there's shades. We all have different shades. We're not just one thing, black or white, we're shades of gray. So to me, my responsibility as a filmmaker in this 21st century and working on this film, MLK FBI, was to make sure that, as we dug into this material and looked at Dr. King's arc, his sort of political and personal arc, we understand that he was not just, the great icon that everyone sees, Dr. Martin Luther King, who has high schools and streets and boulevards and everything named after him. The man who said, I have a dream. But he was a much more complex and layered character. And the other thing that we wanted to make sure that we did as filmmakers, myself, Ben Hadeen, our editor, Laura Tomaselli, and our archival producer, Brian Becker, was to make sure that we tried to dig into the archive to find, King at his softest moments, like when we had the footage of him with his family. King when he looked a little disturbed, when Clarence Jones is saying King was dealing with personal family issues. He had to deal with the fact that the FBI was after him. King when he was at his feeling his most, probably his most happiest when he received the Nobel Peace Prize, So we want to look at King from many different layers, but we also want to look at the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover, who, for me as a young man in the 60s, was this mythic, wonderful, powerful organization where they had the machine guns and they were taking down gangsters. They were taking down the communists, That's how I saw them in the 60s. But understanding that J. Edgar Hoover and William Sullivan, who's one of his right-hand men, their job, they felt like they were frightened of Dr. King, like many people, many white people were, because all of a sudden he was going to upset the status quo of America. It's like where we have the man on the street interviews and the white guy, the older white gentleman says, Hoover says King is worse, but I think he's 10 times worse than that, And the white woman says, I don't like him because he's too uppity. All of a sudden, here was a black man who was stepping out of his place. He wasn't being docile. He wasn't being sort of like, whatever you want me to do, master, I'll do. He was challenging the status quo of America, which, in the 50s, America, apple pie, all of a sudden, there's these boycotts in Montgomery, Alabama. There's these demonstrations in Birmingham. There's the marches from Selma to Montgomery. They were frightened, the March on Washington. That's why when Hoover and the FBI saw that March on Washington, that's why he said he's the most notorious man, in America. He was afraid of him. He was afraid of him. So we felt that it was important to look at all the different aspects of King and Hoover and the FBI, You know, one of the fascinating things that, to me, that's uncovered when you watch this film is after King and Hoover met for the only time, after King said, or Hoover said King was a notorious liar, and they took a poll. The poll basically back in 1964, 65, basically 50% of Americans thought Hoover was the best person. Not
Yeah.
as many people thought so of King. I mean, it's wonderful. It's fascinating how you see things have changed in America, where Hoover now is like, you know, a pariah, and King is like the
Right.
icon. It's amazing sort of thing about history. And it goes back to history is written by those who are in control of it, you know.
Right.
Those who are in control of it can shape it any way they'd like to, you know, and that's what has happened. You know, it has evolved over the years. I was saying to someone earlier, when I was a young man, you know, one of the American heroes was Abraham Lincoln, you know, because he freed the slaves. That was a simple line. But as you know, and as we all know, as history has evolved, as people have written new books about Abraham Lincoln, he was much more complicated. He wasn't so,
Yes.
excited about freeing the slaves initially, you know.
Right. Right.
You know,
right.
so it's just, to me as a documentary filmmaker, it's always important to dig into the material, to look at the people, look at King in a more complex way, look at Hoover in a more complex way, look at America, which, as you know and I know, is very complicated. You know,
Right.
It's not what people like to think. You know, oh, America's the greatest country in the world, freedom and democracy. Well, we know that that's not completely true.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, so yeah, you've already mentioned so many of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because for one thing, for me, one of the most affecting, but really for me, sort of devastating moments is that meeting that you mentioned between MLK and Hoover, the sort of exit interview as he's on his way to the elevator.
Mm-hmm.
You know, by that time in the movie, you've already so carefully and going sort of alternating between telling the story of King and his involvement to giving the sort of major pivot points of his political career from the boycott onward. But by that moment, we know enough of what the FBI has done to King that to see the way that he has put up a front leaving that meeting, that he's leaving saying, you know, I think we reached an understanding. By that point, I think I'd seen that clip before maybe, but by that point in the movie, the way that you have structured all of it and when it arrives, now I'm seeing behind that front that he's put up. Now I'm seeing behind that to be able to imagine what must have actually happened in that room, to be able to imagine the nature of the kinds of threats that Hoover must have been able to make. That for me, when he says we've reached an understanding, it in that moment suddenly seems very euphemistic. And then I'm looking at later footage of him as you know, some of his associates are talking about the things that were weighing very heavily on him as the FBI kept you know, attacking him. Now seeing these images of his grief, his wariness, you just like sort of added for me layer of, these are the pressures, these are the ways that the political structure's ability to surveil and disrupt protest and dissent weigh down on this man in a way that I can see now, in a way that you can see it.
You can see it in the imagery.
You can see it.
Yeah, because what you see now in some of these images, you see that King is nervous. He's worried.
Yeah.
He does this thing with his collar. You know.
Yeah.
You can see that. You know, we all would like to think that all that Dr. King was thinking about was how to, you know, to integrate America, how to, you know, to break down the walls of segregation. But as we all know, as human beings, there were other things going on in his mind. Oh my God, will somebody pick up the idea that I'm not monogamous? Oh my God, you know, what's the struggle I'm having with Coretta, you know? How can
Yeah.
I keep the movement together? As we're progressing forward. Why did I go to Chicago? Oh my God, what happened there?
Yeah.
What's going to happen to me when I decide to take a stance and say America shouldn't be in Vietnam? I mean, these were things that King had to constantly deal with. The reaction of other civil rights leaders when he did take the anti-Vietnam stance, basically saying he had lost his way. I mean, he had a lot of things on his shoulders that he had to confront every day. And then on top of it, you got the FBI creating, this letter basically implicating that King should maybe kill himself, sending a tape to Coretta Scott King to basically say, your husband is not monogamous. Here he is having affairs. I mean, you think about the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who we understand now in these 21st century. But back then, they were like the epitome of the notion of the best of America. It's like describing Chuck Knox, a former FBI agent, describing the kind of agents, or Beverly Gage, I think does this, describing the kind of agents, white men, tall, muscular, who went to college, crew cut, that's how they define the FBI. And it's fascinating. It was the New York Times had an article yesterday about World War II. And there were two different essays from different people. And what was fascinating to me when I was going through that magazine section was the essay about how Black soldiers fighting for our country in World War II had to come back and be disenfranchised. Couldn't even get the recognition with the GI Bill. Had to struggle to be able to find a job, to find places to live. And then on the other hand, you realize when you watch all these movies like Saving Private Ryan or the Green Berets or D-Day, you see nothing but white soldiers, white soldiers. And you have to realize that it was soldiers of color from India, from Africa, also fighting for democracy and not even recognized. I mean, it goes back to what I was saying, who controls the history?
Yes.
And one of the important things for me as a documentary filmmaker is to basically say, here's another way to look at that history that you might not have considered.
Yeah. Well, something you said earlier was about your own relationship to the FBI when you were younger.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really struck me about this movie, it was you don't just briefly make the point about the FBI in popular culture, but you come back and back to those clippings from movies of the era. You're really telling an important, I think, a really important part of this story, which gets to that poll that you mentioned about 50% of America being on Hoover's side in this MLK Hoover debacle, about how much of this is just history being constructed as it's happening, like history being constructed by the FBI through PR campaigns, and how much of this MLK problem comes down to this stuff about image, that this guy is to Hoover such a hypocrite, in part because the image of the man that he's seeing out giving these speeches and doing this protest doesn't match up at all with the man in private. And of course, if you understand that people are complicated, these things shouldn't be so contrary. But Hoover's obsession with image and representation of America and what America's supposed to look like is fascinating. And seeing the way that the rest of the culture participated in that is really something that really just bolsters so much of all the other story that you're telling.
Exactly.
Because it's MLK's story too, right? The image of MLK.
Exactly. But think of it. Here we are about to have a major election in this country in 2021. And you watch the news, and on one side we hear some man saying, if this other person becomes the president of the United States, it will change America. There will be chaos.
Right.
There'll be riots in the streets, I mean, and this like I do, there are people out there who buy into this. Oh my God, America won't be the same anymore if Joe Biden's president. It's crazy. It's really crazy. I mean, quite honestly, if Trump would have probably preferred to have Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren as people who opposed him, because it would give him even more of a dog whistle. Because he could say, see this woman who's a leftist, this commie, socialist who's, you know, a leftist. Look at what they're going to do in America. He can't quite slap that on old Joe Biden.
Yeah, right. But the continuity of those dog whistles
Still
from the stuff that it's crazy. I mean, to even think that specifically Hoover goes to like a women's club to say that that he's the biggest liar in the world.
Yeah,
and he doesn't have to say, right, he doesn't have to say because he cheats on his wife, because he's saying it to a group of women. He knows how it's going to sound. He puts it out there in very controlled ways. I mean, you know, one thing that came across to me about Hoover in this movie is just, not that, you know, we didn't know this, but he's just very savvy about these sorts of things.
And you know, it's fascinating too. I mean, for a man who basically is trying to, you know, make public King's private life,
right?
His personal private life is very complex too.
right. I mean, the ironies are abundant.
It's amazing.
It's quite incredible. Yeah. I wanted to talk to you about just, you know, because, and I've sort of been referencing this all along, but I really, especially when I watched the movie, was really taken with just your fine attention to how you were going to structure this story, because this is all, I mean, you have everything here. You have Vietnam, you have communism and Sam Levinson, and that story is fascinating, and the Kennedys and Johnson, and the ways that these political shifts, political in the sense of the White House and the FBI, intertangle with the personal dynamics, the personal pressures being placed on MLK. You find this way of both really elaborating on who MLK was as a person, but also finding the way to link it always to America writ large as a political place, and that as a filmmaker and you know, someone editing this into something coherent, into an argument. I just wondered how you thought about how you were going to organize this, because it's very coherent, and I got to say, it's really, you know, my heart kind of races as I watch the movie, because I just have this sense of doom and just violation.
Those are two good words. Exactly. Doom, violation.
You know,
the process normally is always, you know, you're basically trying to build out the whole story. I mean, if you had seen our first cut, it was like 2.5 hours, because we basically covered so much material, but we realized that we had to condense it and compress it. And the challenge always is to make it as coherent as possible, you know,
right,
telling the story arc. How much of King's, you know, civil rights activities do we want to weave into the film, but at the same time understanding the larger context? That was always important. His specific civil rights, you know, trajectory, but also in connection with the larger context of America. So it was important to understand where he came from with the Montgomery Bus Boycott. It was important to understand that out of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, he became very close to Stanley Levinson, you know, on the communist, or some people said he was still a communist. And that was a red flag for Hoover and the FBI, because all of a sudden they had been monitoring, you know, Stanley Levinson through some other, you know, informants. And they said, well, if he's a communist, that must mean King is a communist, or wants to become a communist. And then understanding that arc in terms of when King and the other members of the Big Six were deciding on the March on Washington, how the Kennedys reacted to it, you know. And they knew that Levinson was connected to Levinson, basically saying to King, we support your agenda, but you can't be associated with communists. And the complexity.
A remarkable moment.
Yeah, which King sort of, you know, kind of dovetailed and snaked around. And then understanding how all these things sort of worked hand in hand. King all of a sudden getting the Nobel Peace Prize, Hoover's angry response to that, you know.
Right.
King basically initially thinking that he wanted to make a stance on Vietnam, but then pulling back because he knew that he would catch a lot of brickbats. By this time, LBJ and him were cohorts,
right,
you know,
right.
after the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Selma to Montgomery March, and then realizing that he had to make a political stance about Vietnam, but the brickbats that he would have to face, and basically that destroyed his relationship with the LBJ and the White House. So it's again this layering of understanding his sort of personal and civil rights trajectory at the same time because he's a part of this larger context of America. It took some weaving, which always took some real weaving, and to try to make the weaving as coherent as possible. And I got to say that, you know, both our editor, Laura Tomaselli, and Ben Hadeen, the producer, we were all very involved in that process.
Yeah, I mean, and you're bringing up some of the moments that it just, man, it all felt so precarious, right? Like, as you say, the FBI's interest in Stanley Levinson suddenly clarifying his relationship to King as one of those, that's a lucky break for them kind of moments, but also him going to an associate's home that had been bugged. I think it's Clarence Jones, right? Who tells that stories, right? And that being how the FBI finds out about these indiscretions, and that being the thing that says, okay, we're going to take, you know, we're trying to pin subversiveness on him via communism, and we've investigated that, and, you know, Stanley Levinson's materials aren't giving us what we want. But wait, now we have this other, you know, he's also subversive in this other way. Just the pivots that you're also weaving into the story you're telling of just how the FBI's surveillance tactics were adapting this whole time. Exactly. and growing. It just really, I think that's part of why it feels so tragic to me as I'm watching, because you're just watching these two strands or multiple strands sort of happen alongside each other, where the FBI's tactics, its relationship to the White House, all of these things have to be in the right place at the right time, really, for them to find the things that they do and then leverage them the way that they want to. And then that Vietnam thing being the thing that really kind of gets Hoover sort of back into the White House and into the ear of the president, just is really, right. You know, it's really tragic, right? Because this is MLK, right. This is MLK saying exactly what America needed to hear, that this war is distracting from the war on poverty in the US, et cetera, right? And it's tragic, you know, it's
tragic. And to think about it, I mean, you remember the section after King wins the Nobel Prize, he comes back and there's that scene with LBJ in his office, and someone's talking to him in the audio, and he says, you know, King's coming back to America, and they want you to come to this celebration for him. Well, I don't think you should go, you know.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's one level, but that didn't sort of destroy their relationship. But all of a sudden, when King makes the anti-Vietnam stance, LBJ basically says to Hoover, we got to double check what's going on there. These are people who are probably causing all the problems in the streets, you know. You know, he basically is disassociated himself because he was like, all of a sudden, this guy is going to be anti-Vietnam against us being in Vietnam. How horrible. How could he do that? You know, how un-American. How un-American, you know. So,
yeah, I mean,
it's really fascinating.
You get at how singularly fascinated Hoover was with MLK, yes. with Black politics, with just the real sense of threat that he felt, threat to his idea of America, really came across here.
Yeah.
And you also, you know, I really liked that you and the historians that you interview talk about that larger history of sexual threat, of Black sexual threat, and how that relates to politics, because I think that's a connection that I hadn't really heard be so explicitly made, that is part of the fascination with MLK's sexual behavior, is you know, these ideas about the sexuality of Black men and Black people.
Absolutely. Here he was, he's promiscuous, you know.
Yeah.
He's out here doing these horrific things, just like all these other Black men, you know.
Right.
I mean, these labels that's been attached to us. I mean, you know, and the sad thing about it, Cameron, is that, you know, as I watch this film, I've watched it so many times, it speaks so clearly to what America is like today. And I mean, it's sad in a way. America still goes through this in the 21st century, you know.
Yeah.
Goes through this in the 21st century. We have people, I was watching some news show, and the correspondent was interviewing people outside of New York City or California. And you can see some people still have this notion that America is the way it should be from the 1950s, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
It used to be, there was an old saying that used to be in these old movies when someone would say something, someone said, how dare you say that? The person's response would be, well, I'm free, white, and 21.
Right.
You know? And so that means I can do anything and say anything. And the attitude still prevails in lots of white Americans, which is scary. You know.
Yeah, that is scary. I want to. You said something in your intro that I wanted to get back to, which is about the sort of arduous path to making this movie. Can you tell us a little bit about the just the production here and
Sure.
so when you became fascinated with this specific historical problem? Because I also want to talk about some of your previous work in this context, but when you became interested in the subject and then the project.
Well, it really started about 2.5 years ago. Ben Hadeen, the producer, and I had finished a film called Trains Runnin about the 1964 search for two wonderful blues musicians, Son House and Skip James, by these young white music lovers.
Right.
And so after we had finished that film and gotten it out into the world, Ben had read an article. He had read this book about the king and the FBI investigating him, written by this gentleman, Dave Garrow, who was a historian who had written a book, Bearing the Cross, that had won, a Nobel Peace, a Pulitzer, I think.
Right. And he's interviewed in this movie.
Yeah, and Dave Garrow was someone I had known from Eyes on the Prize. He had
right.
interviews, one of our major consultants on Eyes on the Prize. So I was very aware of Dave Garrow and his work.
Right.
And so Ben reached out to Dave about wanting to do a documentary sort of based on his book about the FBI and King. And we went out to Pittsburgh, where Dave lives, over 2.5 years ago. And we did like a 3.5, 4-hour interview with Dave, basically covering lots of the things that he says in the film. Then, like all documentary filmmakers, the next step was to raise the money, to try to raise the money. So we partnered with a few people and we pitched it to a couple of places. One of them was Netflix. We went out to California, Los Angeles, met with the people at Netflix, pitched them, and we had a sizzle reel, and they didn't bite,
Interesting.
They didn't bite. It didn't really grab them. They liked the idea, but they didn't have a bandwidth for it in terms of funding. So then we connected with this company, Cinetic, who repped us. And then they started to go out and pitch it to other people to try to raise the funds. And they brought in a company called Field of Vision and another company called Play Action. And those two companies became the major funders for the film. And it took us, I guess, 1.5 years to get the funding. And we did a second interview with Dave Garrow after those letters came out alleging that King was in the room and this woman was raped. And we wanted a follow-up interview with Dave Garrow to get his perspective and his point of view in terms of, as a historian, how are you going to frame this now, this new aspect of King's life that's been uncovered? And so we did another interview with Garrow, and then we decided we wanted to do some interviews with Clarence Jones, who had been his attorney, Andrew Young, as we all know, was one of King's right-hand men. And we interviewed two historians who did a great job, Beverly Gage and Donna Murch, and another one, a journalist named Matthew Pasquila. I don't pronounce it correctly, maybe dropped his name. And we also interviewed, we decided we wanted to reach out to James Comey. Former FBI.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, and he was, he always kept that letter that the FBI sent to King to, to sort of be a wake-up call to future members of the FBI that you should not do this, So he said yes to an audio interview, which we did. And we went to Texas and interviewed a former FBI agent who had been involved near the end of this sort of, surveillance of King. And he became an agent in the late 60s, early 70s. So it took us, we basically did those additional interviews in the fall of 2019. We brought the editor and archival producer on around October, November. And we finished it pretty fast. And in reality, this is a pretty fast turnaround for a documentary, because the two trains took like 4 years to finish. This one took over, So we brought on a wonderful editor, Laura Tomaselli, who had done the sizzle reel. She's done a fantastic job. We had a wonderful archival producer named Brian Becker, who did a great job. And we hired this wonderful jazz musician named Gerald Clayton from California to compose the score. I think he did an extraordinary job.
I'm trying to remember, because at some point was it during the production of this that the revelations about Ernest Withers came out? Because I remember reading the Times article about that and all my friends and us passing it around, because I certainly did not know that he was an informant before before. Was it him dying, or I'm forgetting what the inciting event was that made that suddenly be pressed.
It was after he died. It was when he died.
Yeah.
But, you know, I had known about Ernest Withers being an FBI informant for over 10 years because a colleague of mine, the late St. Clair Bourne, before he passed away in 2006 or 2007, I think it was, he had been developing and researching a documentary about Ernest Withers, which is now in production with another filmmaker, you know. So, you know,
Okay.
it's been known, but I don't think it's been so widely known as it has now in this film and this upcoming
Yeah.
you know. Well, I'm surprised we haven't gotten pushback from his family, but they knew. They all knew, you know.
Right. I mean, but it's also just go ahead.
You know, it's interesting when we asked Andy Young about Ernest Withers, and I don't think we used that piece in the cut. He basically said that they knew they were informants like James Harrison, but they also knew that, you know, for Withers it was a way to make some money. It was a job, you know. He was informing on the FBI because he needed to make some extra money. I mean, if he had really thought about it, he wouldn't have done it. But I guess he didn't really think about it as deeply as I think he should have. But who knows?
Yeah. And he did it for maybe 18 years.
Many years. And so you see all these classic photos that he did with King and Abernathy on the bus in Montgomery, the I Am a Man picture. And as he was also informing on the, you know, giving information to the FBI. What amazes me is, even if I asked this question to Andy Young in the film, with all this surveillance of Dr. King, how come at the Lorraine Motel they were not aware of an assassin like James Earl Ray, who Andy Young think is the assassin? You know,
right?
Which is
I mean, this comes up. I think even in your you give us a clip of King, you know, pointing out. I think this is when he's in the Bahamas, and I think this is after Hoover says, you know, some damning things about him. I think King's response is, you know, interesting that, you know, the 4 little girls of Birmingham, et cetera, the various racial events that have happened.
Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman. Where's
right? Where's the FBI then?
Yeah.
But they're all over me.
Exactly.
But where are they when we actually, as a public, need them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a really
it's a good question.
You know, you know, you got
it really is.
Yeah, the church bombing in Birmingham. You got Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman being killed.
Yeah,
you know, and all this, and the FBI is nowhere to be seen. You know?
Yeah, and I think someone else in the documentary talks about how when King was going to appear somewhere, you know, this is deep into their surveillance of him, but the FBI's job, it was an all hands on deck thing. It's all about King.
Get King, get King, get King.
Right.
Get all the agents out there as much as you can. I mean, it's amazing.
It's really astonishing. I mean, really, you walk away from the movie, or at least I do, with just this just overwhelming sense of the extent to which the FBI was willing to mobilize all of its power and resources toward disrupting a social movement. You know, like that. It's. I mean, this is part of why it's such a really good thing to be watching right now, because I think this is something that we really cannot forget. That there's an overwhelming part of the MLK story, of the civil rights story, is the political resources put into suppressing Black political protests, Black politics.
And you know that old phrase that, you know, when Jews talk about the Holocaust, African Americans have to have the same phrase: never forget.
Yeah.
Never forget that America will go to any means to destroy Black political protests. They did it with Marcus Garvey. They did it with, you know, with the A. Philip Randolph in the 40s. They did it in the 50s with King in the 60s. They did it with the Black Panthers, the Black Power movement. You know, they're doing it with they're probably infiltrating Black Lives Matter movement. They will go to any means to destroy Black political protests, because for them, it upends the status quo of how one is supposed to look at America. Yeah.
It's really overwhelming to think about. I wanted to talk about this movie in the context of your work broadly, because as we talked about this a little bit earlier, but you are, I feel like across your career, you were really just retelling or digging up these aspects of Black life and Black political life historically, just putting your finger on these stories that can be broadened out to really give us these more comprehensive and nuanced and complicated and sticky and, you know, sometimes uncomfortable even, because, you know, the stuff about MLK is uncomfortable sometimes. As much as I don't think that it in any way changes my opinion about his politics, like it doesn't make me feel any less confident that he's right about Vietnam or poverty, but you know, it's uncomfortable because it brushes against the story that I'd been told about MLK for most of my life, and et cetera.
The storied myth.
Yeah, exactly.
But you know, Cam, here's a few things I'll say about that. You know, when I got into the film business, my agenda was simply to become a film editor and make dramatic films, just to make wonderfully entertaining dramatic films, because I've been indoctrinated in American movies, American notions of how to be a man, how to look at women, how to deal with the West, you know,
right.
America, you know, always right. And then I was very fortunate to be introduced to the world of documentaries by the gentleman who became my mentor when I was a young editor named Victor Konevsky. And delving into documentaries as an editor and learning to make documentaries made me look at the fact that the stories that are told are much more layered and complicated than the ones that I had learned from watching Hollywood films, like the black and white stories.
Yeah.
And then in 1980, I had an opportunity to work with St. Clair Bourne, wonderful documentary filmmaker, on a film about Chicago blues musicians. And spending that 6 months with him in the editing room, he basically relit in my head and made me understand that as an African-American filmmaker, a film editor, that part of my experience, part of my responsibility was to tell our stories, you know. And even though sometimes these stories have, you know, some difficult edges, that's part of the journey. And I've been very fortunate to have been able to work with other filmmakers, to be in situations like with Henry Hampton at Black Side, and that wonderful group of people from Louis Massai to Jackie Shearer, you know, to work on that show, to work on The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow, you know, to work with Spike, who's like an activist all the time, you know, to work on Four Little Girls, to work on When the Levees Broke, you know, to work on Slavery by Another Name, to look at the layered and complicated American experience for the African Americans. So, you know, if you had asked me 40 years ago what I thought my arc would be, I would say, I'm just going to be an editor who's going to make entertaining movies. No, it didn't turn out that way. And I thank God it didn't.
But you know, it's funny you say that, because you do. One thing that I really also like about your work is that it is entertaining. But I, you know, I mean, that MLK-FBI is riveting to me, because even as there are, you know, it wasn't unknown to me. It's not unknown. Even you know, Ava DuVernay's Selma has stuff about the FBI and MLK. Sure. It's stuff that we know, but there are just ways that you find to pull it all together in ways that just the ground keeps shifting beneath my feet. I couldn't predict when I start the movie that you were going to go in all the directions that you're going, and that you're going to touch on the things that you do so thoroughly. Even though FBI is in the title, I didn't think I was going to come away with such a keen sense of Hoover, for example.
I think it's one of the most interesting, you know, character studies of Edgar Hoover I've ever seen myself, if I do say so myself.
I mean, and he's just a fascinating guy, but I agree with you that focusing on his, again, just this single-minded obsession that he has with MLK, it really, I don't think I knew he was that, like, obsessed. Yeah, I really don't think I understood this, because I mean, Hoover's history is so complicated that I think of him in terms of the groups of people. So I think of him in terms of Black politics broadly, and the FBI's involvement. You know, I think of him and even people like James Baldwin, and you know, like I think about the FBI I mean, it's the story. The FBI was onto a lot of people. They have files on a lot of major Black figures.
Yeah.
And thinking about his single-minded pursuit of MLK and how tied to national politics that was, really just, my heart raced a little bit, It really it really is like entertaining.
It was a singular obsession with J. Edgar Hoover, singular,
Were you always interested? Oh, go ahead.
And that's part of the reason that he survived for so many years. He's had this obsession all the time about, routing a country of gangsters, destroying, making sure communism didn't take over the world, destroying who MLK was. Everything was an obsession with this man,
Right. Were you always interested in history per se?
Yeah, in all honesty, even as a teenager, when I was in middle school and high school, I always did like history. Now, I didn't know how much I loved it until I started to make films, but I was always fascinated with history. I was always interested in what was going on in the world, be it in America, be it in Europe, be it in Africa. I was always curious about it. And that's one of the things you have to be when you're making documentaries. You have to have a level of curiosity that you want to learn stuff, you want to dig into stuff, you want to uncover things. And it's a curiosity that has stayed with me from teenage years to now. I still had a fascinating curiosity with learning about people and places and things, and having my particular sort of attitudes upended and saying, "Oh, is that the way you can look at it? Okay, it's interesting." I find history fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, and I have to say, a big credit to your movie for me is you tell so many stories so well that you made me want, now I want the Stanley Levinson documentary. I mean, I'm so interested in him. You already said there's going to be an Ernest Withers documentary, so I am.
Should make a Stanley Levinson documentary. It'd be fascinating. I mean, there was the Harry Belafonte doc a few years back that was on HBO, and there's a little bit on Stanley Levinson in there too.
Okay. Yeah, you have I can tell as I watch that you don't just drop these things in as sort of narrative pivot points, but you really have a real curiosity and find ways to convey even your own surprise at times, it seems. Like the things that you were learning, the things that you were confronting through a documentary that until the end is not a talking head documentary. And we don't hear your voice very often. We hear you occasionally sort of asking questions from behind the camera, but it was interesting to me how much of your own interests I felt from the way that you organized and argued your way through these issues, that I just felt like, okay, this is what's exciting to me. I'm watching a movie by someone who really is not just trying to tell the story, but who has questions.
Is engaged in it.
Yeah, right.
And that's one of the challenges always when making a documentary, is how to make the audience feel engaged because you're engaged in it.
Right.
Saying, I'm presenting information, because it's easy.
Right.
Most times documentaries, you just present information. The challenge is to engage the audience, and that's always a big challenge to me. If you do that well, then you can grab an audience. You can keep an audience really pulled into the film.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, are we almost out of time?
Yeah, it's almost 12.
We should probably be ending whenever you're ready, but before noon. Yeah.
Okay. Like 7 minutes you got.
Okay. Let me see if is there anything that I haven't asked about that you really want to? I'm looking over.
The only thing I would say, I want to say this, is that,
okay,
what's exciting to me is I came up under the tutelage of St. Clair Bourne, and there were other filmmakers like me, like Louis Massai and Stanley Nelson. But now there's another generation of African-American filmmakers, Yoruba Richard, Shala Lynch, Geeta Gandabir, who's South Asian, but she's also a person of color. There's a group of young filmmakers now, Roger Ross Williams, who really are carrying on the mantle of telling these very complicated and interesting stories. And it's definitely important to give them a shout out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I think we're in a real moment for reinvigorating discussions about the complexities, like beyond the myths, beyond what we learned in history books, which are obviously very, at least the ones I grew up with, were very compromised.
Exactly.
You know, I can't imagine anyone who didn't have a kind of compromised historical education, frankly. But yeah, I think I agree with you that we're in a moment where we have more filmmakers carrying on this tradition of asking us difficult questions about our own history that are not about, like, they're not revisionist in the sense that, like, MLK FBI is not a film about, you know, you're not giving us the salacious side of MLK. That's not what it's about. It's about the surveillance apparatus, the political apparatus, and the roles that they played in his life and the roles that they play in the national myths that hold until today. And I agree. We're in a moment where I feel like there are good people doing that work, which is so important. Especially as we're splintering in terms of what we even find credible anymore. It is so important to have people doing historical, you know, really laying down these political and historical arguments in film and not,
it's important. It's important to be able to look at these things in much more complex ways than we've normally seen them. It's important for filmmakers like myself and Stanley and Hoover and Charlotte to be able to help tell our own stories. Very important.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to thank you and to thank you for this wonderful film, which really, I think is going to spur some great conversations.
Maybe the FBI will create a file on me, man.
You know, I mean, if they I'm sure they saw the NYFF lineup. They're just combing through it, looking for who they can add to their list. But thank you very much, and I so look forward to your future work.
Thank you very much, Kim. Have a good day.